beauties. So today's little story of historical facts is about the Salem Witch Trials. It's always been intriguing to many people. I mean, they get a lot of tourists. Some very misguided tourists sometimes, because they'll end up going to Salem, Massachusetts, which the witch trials actually happened in Salem Village, which is now Danvers, Massachusetts. Salem Town became Salem, Massachusetts. And a lot of people don't realize there is a difference. The infamous trials began in the spring of 1692 after some girls basically claimed that they were possessed by the devil and accused several local women of witchcraft and so forth. A special court convened in Salem to hear cases of witchcraft after a wave of hysteria kind of swept through the village. I want to say this was the first recognized case of mass hysteria. I won't swear to that. But it was recognized, not, I mean, it was too long, but it wasn't like super long. The first to be convicted of witchcraft was Bridget Bishop, and that was around June of that year. 18 more would be accused and sent to Salem's Gallows Hill. It's also a misconception that the ones convicted of witchcraft were burned. That was done in Europe. Here in the States, we hung them. More than 150 more men, women, and children were accused. In, the coming months. Sorry, I'm having a real hard time glancing at my notes. By September of 1692, the hysteria started to abate. Public opinion was kind of turning against it. And the general court later annulled guilty verdicts against the accused and granted indemnities to their families. But the bitterness of everything just kind of lingered. And very painful legacy that the trials endure for centuries. The Puritans strongly believed in the supernatural and the devil's practice of giving some humans special powers to harm those in return for their loyalty to the devil. This ideology started as early as the 14th century in Europe and became widespread life for colonial New England. And life was rather harsh in Salem Village for the Puritans. The after effects of the British War with France and the American colonies in 1689, recent smallpox epidemic, fears of attacks from Native American tribes, and long-standing rivalry with the more affluent community of Salem Town. Because Salem Village was more rural and Salem Town was more affluent. Amid the tensions in the Salem Witch Trials, which would be fueled by resident suspicions of and resentment of their neighbors and their fears of outsiders. Puritans weren't exactly the most welcoming into their communities, because they did have this deep-seated fear of outsiders. In January of 1692, 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, who were the daughter and niece, respectively, of Samuel Parris, he was the minister of Salem Village. They began having fits, including violent contortions and uncontrollable outbursts of screaming. And the local doctor, William Griggs, diagnosed them with bewitchment. Then other girls started to exhibit similar symptoms and outbursts. And, including like Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, and Mary Warren. In late February, arrest warrants were issued for Samuel Parris's Caribbean slave Tituba, along with 2 other women, a homeless beggar, Sarah Good, and a poor elderly woman, Sarah Osborne, after the girls accused them of bewitching them. They were brought before the magistrates, Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne. As they were questioned, the girls were in the court and put on this grand display of spasms and contortions and screaming and writhing. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied being witches. Tituba confessed, and most likely to save herself. Not only did she confess, she said she had names of... Sorry, got distracted. I have all this hair falling. Where was I? Oh, that there were other witches acting alongside her in the service of the devil. As the hysteria kind of spread through Salem Village, more were accused, and it also went beyond the borders of Salem Village and more into all of Massachusetts. Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, they were regarded as upstanding members of the church and, in their community, and they were accused. Even a 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good was accused. Several of them confessed, like Tituba, and named others, and the trials began to overwhelm the local justice system. So in May of 1692, the new governor, William Phipps, ordered a special court of oyer and terminer. Now, oyer meaning to hear and terminer to decide. So it was the court of to hear and decide. on witchcraft cases for Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties. Judges Samuel Sewell, William Stoughton, and John Hawthorne presided over the special court. And again, the first conviction was Bridget Bishop, and she was hanged 8 days later. Then 5 more people were hanged in July, 5 in August, and 8 more in September. So this wasn't like something that was really fast moving with the hysteria, and they went to trial, they were hanged, and this and that. This was an extensive period of time. 7 of the accused witches died in jail. Now, Martha Corey, her husband, Giles, was pressed to death by stones. And what that entailed was they had you lay flat, and they would just start placing stones on your body until eventually the weight of the stones would just crush you. Not a pleasant way to go. But he was pressed to death by stones after refusing to enter a plea at his arraignment. So he refused to deny or confess. Still lost his life. Cotton Mather, who was a respected minister, warned of the dubious value of the spectral evidence or testimony about dreams and visions, but his concerns went largely ignored. Increase Mather, his father, joined in with Cotton, urging that the standards of evidence for witchcraft must be equal to those of other crimes. And he was known to have said, "It would be better that 10 suspected witches escape than one innocent person be condemned." And, there are many people still in that line of thinking in today's times of, when it comes to death penalties now, that it would be better to allow, a bunch of the guilty escape death penalty. Still be punished, but just escape death penalty, than to let one person be executed. Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer in October and mandated that its successor disregard spectral evidence due to public support starting to wane on that. The trials continued with less intensity until early 1693, and by May, Governor Phipps pardoned and released those in prison on witchcraft charges. So it didn't take long for them to start to realize that, this really needed to end. This was just, it was ridiculous. Even though it was something that they believed wholeheartedly in, the Puritans had a lot of strange customs and beliefs. And it wasn't just the Puritans. They're just the ones that became more infamous for it. In January of 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting for the tragedy of the Salem Witch Trials. So, 4 years after, 5 years after it started, but 4 years after, they ended, they were already starting to see, that this was a problem. This, a lot of people were killed for no reason. The court later deemed the trials unlawful, and leading Justice Samuel Sewell publicly apologized for his role that he had in the process. But the community remained scarred even after Massachusetts colony passed legislation restoring the good names of the condemned and providing financial restitution to their heirs in 1711. The effects endured well. Not sure what I wrote there. Endured well into the 20th century, with Arthur Miller's play The Crucible in 1953, using them as an allegory for the anti-communist witch hunts led by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, which during that time, what they called the Red Scare was very real. People were building bomb shelters because everybody was certain a nuclear bomb was headed this way, and certain that having the shelters was going to protect them. And you kind of had a hysterical response to that as well, of investigating and accusing. Walt Disney was investigated by Hoover as a communist sympathizer. Walt Disney. Now, he wasn't the greatest of characters by any means, but he was certainly far from a communist. He was a soldier in World War II. Granted, he was driving a truck. He wasn't like, a foot soldier. And was known to draw. We just had a storm move in. But he would draw his cartoons on the side of his truck and everything. So, early on in his life, he wanted to do for kids. He built a train that kids could ride in his front yard. Before he came up with the idea to do Disneyland in Anaheim, which he really wanted it to be more like what Disney World in Orlando is. The problem was, he got landlocked because people saw the potential of what Disney would do. So all these hotels went around him, landlocked him. So when he decided to go to Florida, he bought up swampland, land nobody wanted. Old orange groves and swampland. And that's what Disney World sits on today. It was treated, filled in, it was extensive, and everything. And finally a reporter told him, he's like, I can't sit on this story much longer. He was promised an exclusive. And so, the news finally broke, and as soon as it did, all these hotels started going up. So, he was able to get quite a bit of land. But not all of it was exactly as he envisioned it. I'll have to go into the whole history of Walt Disney, because it's very, very fascinating. And that one I know a little bit better on my own. So, but basically, even today, there's still a lot of interest in reference to the Salem Witch Trials. Like I said, many people traveled to there, but like I said, they often make the mistake of going to Salem, Massachusetts, which really wasn't affected in that sense. It was the rural area of Salem Village, which is now Danvers, that was truly, truly affected. That's where the majority of it went on. But even today, we sit there and say, oh, you're on a witch hunt. And it's a reference to that, because if you confessed, oftentimes they would say, if you just confess, give us the name of another witch, we'll spare your life. And so that's why you had a lot of false confessions going on, because, and they were naming their neighbors. And it was rather sad, because, a lot of them were like, not confessing to something that I didn't do. And that's not unreasonable. So, that's kind of where we get the whole witch hunt. And, these girls just were not, they weren't regretful of what they did. Despite a lot of these people getting killed, because basically they would sit there and pop off a name of somebody they didn't like, as kind of like a revenge. And because of the hysteria, that person was brought in, and then, they did have certain things that they looked for. They would have witnesses sit there and say, this person was looking at me funny, and suddenly my cow died. Things like that, and it just perpetuated. And it was a great tragedy in our history. A lot of great tragedies and travesties that occurred that never should have. But, when we look back on it with eyes of today, it's easy to sit there and say, oh, well, they were foolish for believing in this. But at the time, it wasn't just one or two persons believing it. This was communities that were believing in this. Part of their religion was teaching on this. So when you look back at history, you don't just look at the facts. You have to look at how things were perceived then, how they were thinking then. It's easy to play Monday night quarterback, okay? Sit there and look at it and say, oh, well, they were wrong for this, they were wrong for that. Yeah, they were. But if you take yourself back in time and put yourself in that situation, you probably wouldn't think the same way that you do today. And, it's not trying to excuse behaviors. It's just That's how it was. And, you know, things today that we feel is completely normal, 50 years from now, somebody's going to go, well, oh, they were really foolish for this. And they'll be right. You know? So you have to think of things in a logical sense, and a lot of with history, you really have to take your emotion out of it and look at the facts, look at how people thought then, how they felt then, to be able to kind of understand it. It's not to excuse it. And a lot of things, you know, we need to make sure never happen again. But if you can think of that kind of way, logically, and put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can get a better understanding. You know, and the same is true in today's time, you know, with a lot of what's going on. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. See how they're seeing it. See how they feel about it. And a lot of it's understandable. Doesn't make it right, but you can get a better feeling and more compassion for the other person. Instead of being negative and bitter and at everybody's throats, just thought about it logically. And embrace that everybody thinks differently, and that's what makes us great. So reach out to someone with different views and just maturely have a conversation. Understand their points. Get them to understand your points. And I bet you'll come a little closer together. You won't necessarily change each other's viewpoints, but you might be able to come a little bit together and have some peace. And that's all that I truly wish for, is that people could just do that and have some peace. And with that, I will say goodbye. If you like what you saw, ring the bell, smash the thumbs up, leave me a comment. Tell me about other things you want to see. If there's a specific person in history or a topic or a subject, bear in mind, there are some subjects that I will strictly do on a factual basis. Taking complete emotion out of it and just do it on the facts. Because some of them are just too controversial. I don't want to shut anybody out. So, tell me things you want to see. With that, goodbye, my beauties.